Welcome aboard the sleep train, a nightly journey through stillness and stars. Tonight, as the carriage hums beneath you and the rhythm of the rails begins to slow your breath, allow yourself to let go of the day. Each sound, each word is here to ease you deeper into rest. There's nothing to do, nowhere to be, just the soft pull of sleep drawing you forward, station by station, dream by dream. So settle in, rest your head. The sleep train departs now into the quiet of the night. The station stood at the edge of the known world, where the cobblestone streets of the old town gave way to meadows that stretched into twilight mist. Mabel had arrived just as the lamplighters were making their rounds, touching each glass globe with their long poles, bringing forth a warm amber glow that pushed gently against the gathering dusk. She clutched her worn leather satchel close, feeling the weight of the single book inside, a gift from her grandmother, pressed into her hands that very morning with mysterious instructions to travel to this particular station and wait for a train that wasn't listed on any timetable. The platform itself was unlike any she had encountered before, built from smooth grey stone that seemed to hold the last rays of sunlight within its surface, releasing them slowly as evening deepened. Wooden benches lined the waiting area, their backs carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines that appeared to shift and sway when viewed from the corner of one's eye. A clock tower rose above the station house, its face showing not numbers but symbols she didn't recognize, and its hands moved in a rhythm that felt more like breathing than the mechanical tick of ordinary time. The air carried the scent of jasmine and old wood smoke, mingling with something else, something that reminded Mabel of the stories her grandmother used to tell, tales of places that existed between the folds of the everyday world, accessible only to those who knew when and where to look. She wasn't alone on the platform. An elderly gentleman in a burgundy waistcoat sat reading a newspaper that rustled with unusual softness, and a young boy no more than 10 years old swung his legs from a bench nearby, humming a tune that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. Neither looked up as Mabel approached, yet both seemed aware of her presence in that peculiar way that strangers in liminal spaces often are, connected by their shared waiting, their shared purpose, though none had spoken it aloud. Above them, swallows darted through the rafters of the platform roof, their wings catching the lamplight, and somewhere in the distance Mabel heard the first whisper of rails beginning to sing, a sound like silver bells heard underwater, announcing the approach of something extraordinary. She found herself drawn to the edge of the platform, where a painted white line marked the boundary between safety and the tracks below. Beyond the rails, the meadows rolled away into shadow, dotted here and there with wild flowers that glowed faintly in the dimness, foxglove and moonwort, fairy roses and witch bells, all the flowers from her grandmother's stories. The rails themselves were polished to such brilliance that they reflected the emerging stars, and as Mabel gazed down at them, she could have sworn she saw not just the reflection of the heavens above, but entire constellations that belonged to no sky she had ever studied. The singing of the rails grew stronger, a harmonious resonance that she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears, and then, emerging from the mist like a thought becoming solid, she saw it. The train, its carriages gleaming softly in the twilight, each window illuminated not by electric light but by the warm, dancing glow of candles. hundreds upon hundreds of them, turning the approaching train into a moving cathedral of gentle flame. The train arrived without the harsh screech of brakes or the industrial hiss of steam that Mabel had expected. Instead, it simply seemed to settle into place, as though it had always been there, and she had only just now noticed it. The engine was painted a deep midnight blue, decorated with silver filigree that depicted phases of the moon in their eternal cycle, and from its smokestack rose, not black coal smoke, but a pearlescent mist that smelled of lavender and distant rain. Each carriage was different, she noticed. Some painted with scenes of forests under starlight, others showing cities that might have existed in dreams, and still others decorated with nothing more than elegant swirls of gold and copper that seemed to move like living things across the polished wooden panels. But it was the windows that captured her attention most completely, for within each one, candles of various heights and thicknesses burned with steady flames, creating a warm, inviting glow that made the evening suddenly feel less like an ending and more like a gentle beginning. The carriage doors opened without sound, and from the nearest one descended a figure who could only be the conductor. He was tall and lean, dressed in a uniform of deep forest green with brass buttons that gleamed like captured fireflies, and on his head sat a cap embroidered with silver thread in patterns that reminded Mabel of railway maps, though these maps showed routes to places whose names she sensed rather than read. His face was ageless. He might have been 40 or 400, with kind eyes that held depths of understanding, and a slight smile that suggested he knew something wonderful that he was waiting for just the right moment to share. In his hand, he carried not a modern ticket punch but an antique lantern, and inside it burned a candle of unusual colour, not quite white, not quite gold, but something in between, like captured moonlight given substance. He moved along the platform with the grace of someone who had walked these boards 10,000 times before, greeting the elderly gentleman with a subtle nod, offering a conspiratorial wink to the young boy, and finally coming to stand before Mabel with that same gentle, knowing smile. "Good evening, traveller," he said, and his voice was exactly what Mabel thought it would be, warm and deep, with the kind of resonance that made you think of libraries and fireplaces, of secrets kept safe and stories waiting to be told. "I am Lucas, conductor of this evening's service." "I believe you're travelling to the first star station?" Mabel opened her mouth, unsure how to respond, for she had no ticket and had been given no destination, only the instruction to wait for this train. But Lucas raised a gloved hand gently, and somehow that gesture was all the reassurance she needed. "Your grandmother sent word ahead," he explained, and from his pocket he produced not a ticket but a small brass key, warm to the touch when he placed it in her palm. "Carriage 7 is prepared for you. The candles have been asking for someone with your particular dreams all evening, you see. They're quite particular, candles are, about whose wishes they illuminate and whose stories they help tell. Take your time boarding. We leave when the last swallow returns to her nest beneath the platform roof, which gives us a few moments yet. The night is patient, and so are we." With that, he touched the brim of his cap and moved on to help the young boy with his small trunk, leaving Mabel holding the brass key and feeling as though she had just stepped across an invisible threshold into a story she'd been reading all her life without knowing she was meant to be its protagonist. Mabel found carriage 7 near the middle of the train, its door marked with the number wrought in elegant brass numerals that caught and reflected the candlelight from within. She inserted the key into the lock, and the door opened with a whisper, revealing an interior that stole her breath completely. The carriage was not divided into separate compartments as she had expected, but instead formed one long, intimate space that felt somehow larger than the carriage's exterior dimensions should have allowed. The walls were panelled in rich mahogany that glowed with the patina of age, and set into them at regular intervals were small niches, each one holding a candle of different size and colour: cream and ivory, pale gold and soft rose, each burning with a steady flame that cast no shadows but rather seemed to fill every corner with layered light. The seats were upholstered in burgundy velvet, deep and soft, with cushions that looked as though they had been waiting specifically for her to sink into them. Above, the ceiling was painted with a mural of the night sky, but this was no ordinary astronomical chart. The stars actually twinkled, and occasionally a painted comet would drift slowly across the dark expanse, leaving a trail of silver that faded as gently as a sigh. She chose a seat near the centre of the carriage, by a window where the candlelight reflected in the dark glass created the illusion of floating in a space filled with warm, golden stars. The moment she settled into the velvet cushions, she understood why her grandmother had sent her here. The exhaustion she had been carrying from the endless tasks of daily life, from the worries that circled like birds of prey, from the feeling that she had somehow lost the thread of her own story, began to loosen its grip. The gentle rocking motion of the train, which must have begun moving though she hadn't noticed the moment of departure, created a rhythm that her breathing unconsciously matched. The candles flickered in perfect synchronicity, and she realized they were responding to the train's movement, creating a dance of light that was hypnotic in its gentleness. On a small table beside her seat, she found a pot of tea that was somehow exactly the right temperature, and a china cup painted with the same kind of mystical symbols that had adorned the clock tower. When she poured the tea, its aroma suggested chamomile and honey, starlight and forgotten lullabies, and when she sipped it, she felt warmth spread through her chest like the memory of every peaceful evening she had ever known. Through the window, she watched as the world transformed. They were no longer passing through ordinary countryside, but through landscapes that existed in that peculiar territory between waking and dreaming. She saw forests where the trees were hung with lanterns instead of leaves, each one glowing with soft blue light. She saw villages where smoke rose from chimneys in spirals of silver and gold, and children played in streets paved with moonstones that pulsed gently with their own illumination. She saw lakes that reflected not the sky above them, but skies from other seasons, other times, so that one might show a summer sunset, while the next revealed the aurora borealis dancing across northern winter darkness. The train moved smoothly through this realm, its passage marked by the gentle singing of the rails and the soft chiming of bells that hung somewhere in the carriage. Bells she couldn't see but could hear perfectly, marking time in a way that made hours feel like moments and moments feel like eternities. Mabel understood, with the kind of knowing that requires no explanation, that this train travelled not just through space but through the territories of rest itself, carrying its passengers away from their weariness and toward a place where dreams were not escapes but homecomings. Mabel was so absorbed in the passing dreamscapes that she didn't notice when the door to carriage 7 whispered open, admitting 2 new passengers. The first was the young boy from the platform, who she now saw carried a battered case that could only contain a musical instrument. He had bright, curious eyes and hair that stuck up in several directions, despite obvious attempts to tame it, and he wore a jacket several sizes too large that must have been handed down from an older sibling. Behind him came someone Mabel hadn't seen on the platform, a woman perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair braided with ribbons the colour of autumn leaves, and a face that suggested she laughed often and deeply. She wore a travelling cloak that seemed to be made from twilight itself, shifting between purple and blue and grey depending on how the candlelight touched it, and she carried a basket covered with a cloth embroidered with protective symbols. Lucas the conductor appeared briefly in the doorway behind them, that knowing smile still playing at the corners of his mouth, and gestured for them to make themselves comfortable before disappearing again into the connecting corridor, leaving the 3 travellers to become acquainted in the way that fellow journeyers on mysterious trains inevitably do. The boy chose a seat across from Mabel and immediately began rummaging in his case, producing not a musical instrument but a sketchbook and a set of pencils worn smooth with use. "I'm Oliver," he announced with the straightforward confidence of the young. "This is my 3rd journey on the Candlelit Carriage. I'm going to visit my aunt who lives at the station between years. She teaches people how to remember their dreams properly, you see. And I'm supposed to learn from her during the summer holidays, except here there aren't really holidays because time works differently. Are you going far? Some people only travel 1 or 2 stations, but others go all the way to the end of quiet, which is actually the beginning of something else, though no one will tell me what." Before Mabel could formulate a response to this rush of information, the woman settled into a seat nearby with a rustling of her remarkable cloak and set her basket on the table. "I'm Cordelia," she said, her voice rich and warm like honey drizzled over toast. "And you mustn't mind Oliver. He has the gift of questions, which is rarer than you might think. Most people have forgotten how to ask properly curious questions by the time they're his age. I'm travelling to the Starfall Market, where I sell remedies for various ailments of the spirit. Loneliness mostly, and the kind of sadness that comes from forgetting what wonder feels like." She began to unpack her basket, producing small glass bottles filled with liquids that glowed softly in the candlelight. Amber and rose, violet and silver green, each one labelled in handwriting so beautiful it might have been calligraphy. Mabel found herself relaxing into conversation in a way she hadn't with strangers for years, but then she reflected there was something about this place, this train, that made ordinary social barriers seem unnecessary and slightly absurd. She told them about her grandmother, about the mysterious gift of a book and the instruction to take this journey, though she still wasn't entirely certain where she was going or why. Oliver listened with the intensity of the young while his pencil moved across the sketchbook, and Mabel glimpsed that he was somehow capturing not just her face, but the feeling of what she was saying, translating words into lines and shadows. Cordelia nodded knowingly at various points in the story, occasionally interjecting with observations that were both profound and practical. "Ah, yes, grandmothers are the traditional guardians of the paths between worlds," or "a book given at twilight always contains more than words. There are entire worlds pressed between such pages." The 3 of them settled into that peculiar companionship, that forms between travellers who recognise in each other a shared understanding that the world is stranger and more wonderful than most people allow themselves to believe. Outside, the dreamscape continued to unfold, and inside Carriage 7, the candles burned steady and true, witnesses to the forming of a friendship that would outlast this single journey, and perhaps endure through many stations and seasons yet to come. As the train carried them deeper into the night, or perhaps deeper into whatever lay beyond night, Cordelia suggested they share stories to pass the time. "It's an old tradition on the Candlelit Carriage," she explained, producing from her basket a small packet of biscuits that smelled of cinnamon and cardamom. "The candles listen, you see, and they remember. Some say that every story told in their light is stored somehow in their wax, and that's why the candles here never completely burn down. They're sustained by the stories as much as by their wicks and fuel." Lucas once told me that there are stories in these candles that date back to the very first journey the train made, decades or centuries ago, depending on which calendar you consult. Who would like to begin? Oliver's hand shot up immediately, and without waiting for permission, he launched into a tale about a boy who discovered he could step into paintings, but only at museums after closing time, and only into paintings of places where dusk was falling. His telling was animated and enthusiastic, full of dramatic pauses and whispered revelations, and as he spoke, Mabel noticed that the candlelight seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with the excitement of his narrative, growing brighter at moments of discovery and dimming to barely a glow during the suspenseful passages. When Oliver finished, Cordelia contributed a story from her own childhood about a grandmother, her grandmother, she said with a significant look at Mabel, who had owned a shop that sold memories. Not one's own memories, mind you, but memories that had been lost or misplaced by others. The memory of a first snowfall, the memory of laughing so hard your sides ached, the memory of feeling completely at peace. People would come to the shop when they felt they had lost touch with joy or wonder, and Cordelia's grandmother would find just the right memory to help them remember how to feel such things again. As Cordelia spoke, she occasionally held up one of her glowing bottles, and Mabel understood that this was the work she continued, her grandmother's work translated into a new form for a new generation. The story wove itself around the listeners like a soft blanket, and Mabel felt her eyelids growing heavy, not with the exhaustion that had plagued her before boarding the train, but with the peaceful tiredness that comes from being exactly where one is supposed to be, doing exactly what one is meant to be doing. Then it was Mabel's turn, and she found herself speaking almost without conscious decision, telling them about the book her grandmother had given her, a book she hadn't yet opened, but whose weight in her satchel had been a constant presence since the beginning of this journey. She talked about how her grandmother had always seemed to exist slightly outside of normal time, how she had known things she shouldn't have known, and appeared in places she couldn't possibly have travelled to so quickly. She spoke about childhood visits to her grandmother's cottage, where the clocks all told different times and none of them were wrong, where the garden grew flowers that bloomed at midnight, and where the cat had eyes that saw things invisible to human sight. As she talked, she finally reached into her satchel and withdrew the book, and in the candlelight its leather cover seemed to shimmer with possibility. When she opened it at last, she found not printed text but handwritten pages, and she recognized her grandmother's handwriting immediately. "My dear Mabel, the first page read. "By the time you read this, you will be aboard the Candlelit Carriage, travelling toward the rest you so desperately need. What you will find at journey's end is not an arrival, but a remembering of who you were before the world convinced you to be someone else. Read on, and let the candles guide you home." The candles flickered all at once as though in acknowledgement, and Mabel felt tears of relief and recognition sliding down her cheeks, and Cordelia reached over to pat her hand while Oliver, with the wisdom sometimes possessed by the young, simply returned to his sketching, giving her the gift of companionable silence. Mabel must have dozed, lulled by the rocking of the train and the gentle breathing rhythm of her companions, because she woke to Lucas's voice announcing their approach to the first star station. Through the window, she saw they were arriving at a platform that seemed to exist in the space between earth and sky. Below them, far below, she could see the twinkling lights of the ordinary world, while above and around them stretched the infinite expanse of stars, so close and bright that she felt she could reach out and trail her fingers through them. The platform itself was constructed of something that looked like crystal, but chimed like silver when the train's wheels touched upon it, and it was populated by figures that might have been passengers, or might have been something else entirely, beings of light and story, attendants of the threshold between waking and dreaming. Cordelia gathered her basket and prepared to disembark, explaining that the Starfall market was just beyond the station, accessible through a door that appeared only when the first star of evening and the last star of morning occupied the same point in the sky. Oliver would be continuing on to the station between years, but he pressed his sketchbook open to a page where he had drawn the three of them sitting in Carriage 7, surrounded by candles that seemed to actually flicker on the page. "So, you remember," he said simply, tearing the page out carefully and handing it to Mabel before Lucas called him to help with his luggage. Mabel stepped out onto the crystal platform, her satchel over her shoulder and her grandmother's book clutched to her chest. The air here was different, clearer and somehow lighter, as though it contained more oxygen or perhaps more possibility than ordinary air. She could breathe more deeply than she had in months, maybe years, and with each breath she felt the accumulated weight of her weariness lifting away like morning mist before the sun. Lucas appeared at her elbow, his lantern casting its between-colour light across the platform. "This is your station," he said gently, "beyond that archway." He pointed to a structure made of living branches that still bore leaves and blossoms, despite being clearly wooden in nature. "You'll find the Garden of First Rest, where your grandmother has prepared a cottage for you. You'll stay as long as you need. Time here doesn't pass the way it does elsewhere, so you needn't worry about obligations or schedules waiting for you back in the other world. When you're ready to return, simply walk back to this platform at any evening hour, and the candlelit carriage will come for you." He smiled then, that full, warm smile that transformed his face from merely kind to radiant. "And Mabel?" "Your grandmother was one of the first passengers I ever carried, back when I was new to this work and still learning how to read the candles. She taught me that the purpose of this train is not to help people escape their lives, but to help them rest deeply enough that they can remember why their lives are worth returning to. I think you'll find what she's prepared for you does exactly that." Mabel walked toward the archway, pausing once to look back at the train. Through the windows of Carriage 7 she could see new passengers settling in. the candles already beginning their gentle dance of welcome. Oliver waved from a window in another carriage, and Cordelia, standing at the entrance to a door that shimmered with star-full light, raised her hand in blessing. Mabel waved back, then turned toward the archway and the soft glowing path beyond it. As she passed beneath the living branches, she heard them whisper in a voice she recognized, her grandmother's voice, saying words that seemed to have been waiting for her all along. Welcome home, dear heart. Welcome to the place where you can finally fully rest. The world will wait for you, and when you return to it, you will be yourself again. Not the tired, diminished version you've become, but the full, true self you've always been beneath the weariness. Walk forward now, and let the first star light your way to peace. And so Mabel walked on, into the garden where the cottage waited, with its own candles burning in every window, walked into a rest so deep and healing that when she finally did return to the ordinary world, she would carry that light with her always, a candle in her own heart that no wind could extinguish, a reminder that the candlelit carriage would always be there, waiting at the edge of the known world, ready to carry weary travellers home to themselves again, one gentle journey at a time. We've reached the final stop for tonight. The world beyond the window is still, wrapped in silver mist. If you're already asleep, may your dreams carry you further along the line. And if you're still awake, take one last deep breath and let the gentle rhythm of the rails guide you the rest of the way. Thank you for travelling aboard the sleep train. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.